So what you're looking at right here, just as a general introduction, this is the landing page for a Pressbooks network, and this is QUT's Pressbooks network. So a Pressbooks network is a single collection of as many open books or open sites as you'd like to publish. And so you'll notice at QUT's, there's some nice welcoming text that describes what's happening with open textbooks and how you can find out more. And it also invites people to create a book or to find out more. And you can see that there are other networks by other institutions that look similar with similar kind of invitations. So here's another institution in Australia that's also using Pressbooks, and this is kind of how they've presented their homepage and present some information. Some people have a contact form or a catalog. You can see the Rebus Press has a network that looks similar. Here's another example from the United States, Iowa State, that has a network that looks similar. And what will generally happen is, if you'd like, anybody who wants to at the university can create their own book or several books. And the idea in Pressbooks is that each book would then have its own landing page. So here's an example of a single book that's published on a Pressbooks network. So what we're seeing here is that the book has its own URL. The book can display a title and the author information. You could have a short description with a link or some other information. We're displaying the copyright license. It could be all rights reserved. It could be a Creative Commons license. If you're doing open books, we hope that it's a Creative Commons license or public domain. It's got a title here. In this case, the authors have chosen to make the book available for download in lots of different formats as well. So if I didn't have reliable internet access, but I wanted this book in the EPUB format, I could download it. Or I wanted to print the book at a local print shop or do a print on demand. I could download a PDF that's formatted for print, or any of the other formats that these authors have chosen to make available there. You'll also notice that a book homepage will have a table of contents. So it will show you kind of what's in this book. And I could say, oh, I would like to read the engagement guide first. And I jump into the book and I'm now at the engagement guide. And I could again find that table of contents here as I'm reading the book and go anywhere else I want in the book. If I came back to the homepage below the table of contents, there's the sections that generally only librarians love. It's the metadata, right? The book information. But this book will give me a description, more about the authors, the license, and the subject. And then at the bottom, there's even more metadata, which may be useful for publishing or displaying other information about the book and the title. So in this case, we'll see a primary subject, a publisher, a date. If you have an ISBN or a DOI, those would also be displayed there and would be associated with the book. Here's another example of another book that was published with Pressbooks. You'll see similar features here, the same kinds of things that I was showing. Table of contents here. I picked this one because it's about math and financial stuff, and so you'll see in the book, you might have various text boxes to show learning objectives or to show kind of headings and subheadings and long content in this particular book with some tables. I'm scrolling down a shaded text box, some images with captions, probably. More tables, more tables. This is a pretty enormous chapter. They chose to make it one very long chapter, and it goes on, and the reader scrolls and scrolls and scrolls. So that's a couple examples of what a book that has been created with Pressbooks might look like. And I want to show also that Pressbooks can be used in addition to just presenting like the kind of text that you would ordinarily provide in like a print situation, but online. There's a couple of other features that are pretty common and pretty useful when we're building books that live on the web first. So I studied poetry for my graduate degree, and one of my favorite poets was a Wisconsin poet named Lorene Niedecker. She's kind of a 20th century Emily Dickinson's, really tremendous, and you should check her out if you don't already know her. So here I'm presenting a little bit of context about one of Niedecker's poems. And then here's the poem itself. And then following the poem, I built a multi-part assessment in Pressbooks using a tool called H5P. And I know many people are familiar with H5P. If you're not, I'll show you a couple of examples later on. But here, after someone's read the poem, they might be asked to take this multi-part assessment. So the student would check their answer and say, okay, I got that one correct. Let's move on to the next question. And this one's a fill-in-the-blank question. So I'd say the answer is Abraham Lincoln here. And Black Hawk was 65 years old at the end of this war. And I could check those. I got all of those correct. I'm ready to move on to the next question. And then I want to select the word. So it asks me to find all the rhyme words in this poem. And let's say I get this wrong. I got 2 out of 4. I could show the solution. Okay, I studied this. I'm ready to retry it. I see sold and old are the rhyme words, and bloom and a room are the rhyme words. So now I've retaken this assessment as a learner, I'm ready to move on. We're doing formative assessment here rather than summative, but the poem, we can answer this true-false question, and we'll answer the final true-false question. And then at the end here, I'll say, okay, here's the result I did on this overall assessment. I could show the solution and study it again, or I could just retry the assessment. You could build many of these and many different types of these all throughout a book. Here's just a couple of examples. You'll also notice in this book, I've got a footnote. And if I hover over the footnote, you'll see it appears as a tooltip. Or if I click on the link, it will take me down to the actual footnote. I've read the footnote and I'm ready to jump back to the text. It takes me back up to the text. You'll also see this dashed line. This is what's called a glossary term. If I were to click on the glossary term, I've written a definition in for the book. And that could appear as a pop-up definition where I could learn more about this particular defined term. And I'm not sure how well you're able to see it on my screen share here, but I also have a number of pieces of text that are highlighted in yellow. These are annotations. So we have a built-in integration with an annotation tool called Hypothesis. And what Hypothesis lets me do is if I click on the annotation, this annotation pane will expand. And I'll see that someone has annotated the word Jonathan Williams to tell you more about who Jonathan Williams was. And there's a link here in this annotation. In the margin, I can see that there's a total of 17 annotations on this particular page. If I view them all, you can see, okay, some of them are textual. Some of them have images, so I could see the cover of this book that Niederker published and a title page. Some of them have links. Here's a discussion question for the class. And I asked them, who was Black Hawk? It was a Native American leader, and that might be a thing I want my class to answer. So the class could click reply and answer that question. If I were to come down further, there's a bit of audio here, and here's Niederker reading one of her poems.
Foreclosure. Tell him to take my bare walls down.
That tremulous little voice, right? I love it. Okay. And then if I come down even further, you can see there's other kinds of things. So I'm leading them through an activity here. I'm showing them a historical marker that's related to this poem. And then in the reply, there's also a YouTube video and a link. And there's all the kinds of interactive things you might want to do. Rather than having it be done in the text, this could be done by learners in the annotation layer. This could be totally public, as this particular book and annotation activity are. Or I could make a private group for my students. So I've got an annotation layer called English Class, and I could have a whole separate set of annotations here. And I could say, make a new annotation and say, read this book. Boo, or whatever, I mistyped it. But you can see how this is an annotation layer that's now private. Only people in my class will see this. And then I could switch back to public and see a different set of annotations on the same text at the same time. So there's a number of things that you can do here, just imagining what's possible here with a Pressbook. I wanted to pause there and say, in the chat, have I missed any questions? Is there anything that people want to ask just generally about what Pressbooks is and what you might want to make with it before I jump into the specific kind of how to do all these things? Okay, I saw a question from Gillian, I'm not sure. Will it get a DOI or apply for one? So the question there is, does every book have a DOI? That's really up to you. If you issue DOIs, they can be associated with the book. And I can show you how to do that in just a moment. But that's really up to the individual institution, whether they issue DOIs for their books. You can also, if it's an edited collection, maybe each chapter had it, or was it an article that had its own DOI. So you can associate DOIs at both the book level and at the chapter or sub-book level. Any other questions about anything that's come up so far that you wanted to ask about, either in the chat or by unmuting?
Hello, Catherine Radbourne here. I'm one of the liaison librarians for nursing. I was wondering, with the Pressbooks, are they discoverable in our library catalogue?
Really good question. I think that's going to depend on a couple of things. So each Pressbook title has a bunch of metadata that's available for it, and you could produce probably a MARC record and ingest it into your catalog. That's probably the most common way that we've seen people do that. They'll make a MARC record for their book, or they'll get it into OCLC's WorldCat in some other way. But another thing that we've seen institutions do, this is not the same question, but we also have a plugin that allows you to, if you're using DSpace as an institutional repository, we have a plugin that will let you automatically export and take your book and then store it in your DSpace repository. And again, the cataloging of the metadata and the entry and the integration with your library catalog is a kind of usually an institution by institution question, but it's certainly possible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so what I want to show you now is, I've shown you some of the finished products, but I would now want to show you how you could use Pressbooks to do a couple of different things. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to come to the Queensland, the QUT Pressbooks network. If you've never been to this Pressbooks network before, you'll see something that looks like this when you first visit. It's qut.pressbooks.pub. And if you want to follow along, you're welcome to. Otherwise, this is going to be recorded. You could just do it at your convenience later. We're going to click the sign in button. I believe that many of you have been already issued Pressbooks account or been invited. So you would enter your username and your password here. Mine's been stored for me, so I'm going to click this stages. And then once you do log in, you should see either an admin or a My Books link or both. If you were to click My Books, it would take you to a menu that should look like this. It should say My Books, and it should say create a new book or clone a book. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new book. So we're going to make a new book. I already made one called Training Demo, so I'm going to use that one for this training. But you could, at this point, it's going to say, where do you want this book to live? And so you're going to pick the URL where your book will live. The first part of the URL will be qut.pressbooks.pub, and the last part will be whatever you want it to be. It needs to be letters and numbers only. It has to be at least 4 characters, and it's very difficult to change once you've created it, so try to choose wisely at the beginning. Your network managers can change it if you really made an error, but it's better to not change it. And then you would enter a title of the book, and then you would click Create Book. So if you wanted to create a book, that would be how you go about creating a blank, empty shell. I'm going to go ahead and pretend that I just did that, and I'll take myself to a new book that's just been created. When you're in a new book, you'll see a book dashboard, and there's all of these different options along the left, and you'll see there's an empty shell here. The first thing I want to show you is how you might find existing content elsewhere and bring it into Pressbooks. So you can write your content from scratch in Pressbooks, but in many cases you're bringing already existing content, whether it's been written in a Word document or whether you have an EPUB or whether you have open content from somewhere else. You're often trying to bring content in or ingest it. And so in Pressbooks, if you click Tools and Import, you'll see a number of different options for bringing already existing content into Pressbooks. You can import from an EPUB file if you have one and you have the permission to bring it in. You can import from a Microsoft Word file or an Open Office document or an XML file from a WordPress or a Pressbooks site, or even from a website or even another Pressbooks book. So I'll show you first, the most common case would be a Word document. I have a Word document already prepared on my computer, so I'm going to click Choose Files, and I'm going to click Chapter Import here. And I've picked the file, and I'm going to say Begin Import. So you'll see very quickly Pressbooks uploaded the file, and it says, oh, okay, in this Word document, I think you've created 6 different chapters. Which of these do you want to bring in as chapters in Pressbooks? I'll say all of them, and I want to show this content in the web, so I'm going to say Import the selection. So it took me just a few seconds, and that Word document has now been created as content in Pressbooks. So if I were to view that chapter, here is the content I just brought in. I had some headings in there, I had a footnote, I had a text box, and all of that came into Pressbooks. If you'd like to know a little bit more about this, there's a guide that talks about these things that are called shortcodes. Many of these things were built with shortcodes, and so these are the different shortcodes you can use in your Word document or prior to importing. So I'll paste that link there in the chat, and the general Pressbooks user guide has, you know, almost, I think, about 100 chapters now. It covers all different kinds of topics, including many of the things that I'm talking about in this training. Okay, so I've just imported some content, and you can see how it came in pretty nicely. Some of them had columns, so I could show you what it looks like to have a column display. This was just text with bold and bullet lists. And you can see my content came in okay there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I've got a book here that I really like called Guide to Publishing Open Textbooks So Far. This book I showed you earlier in the demo, this was published with Pressbooks, and it has an open license. So I can take this book and I can import part of it, and we can use something that we built called an API that helps us do that. So I'd say tools, import, and in this case, I'll pick a Pressbooks webbook and I'll choose import from URL and I'll just paste the URL. And now what's happening is this QUT network is going to talk to the Rebus network and say, oh, here's this book. Which parts of this book do you want to bring in? So let's say I only want these 4 chapters and these 2. So I'm going to grab 6 chapters from that book and leave the rest and just import those. So it takes a few seconds here, but it will go and grab that content, clone it or copy it into my book. And now my book has not just the original chapters I brought in, but these 6 new ones that came from that other book I just cloned from. So those are 2 quick ways to bring content in that already exists. Does anyone have any questions about importing content or things they want me to go over again or explain in more detail?
Hi, Steele, it's Katja here. Just a question with the licensing. When you're bringing across some content from another book, does it automatically bring the licensing with it? If it's Creative Commons, presumably? Yep.
Yes. So if you'll notice in this particular chapter, you'll see each chapter has metadata that's associated with it. And you can see the attributions came from the original Pressbook. These were the people who were responsible, the authors. And here was the attribution, the copyright license that they had chosen for their work. If it had had a different license, that license would have been different for the piece that I imported.
That's great.
If you're importing from a Word document or a EPUB, it won't know. We have no way of knowing what the CC license is, so you'd have to go in manually and make sure that the license that you listed reflected the license of the source.
Sure. Yep. Terrific. Thank you.
Great question. Okay, so in addition to being able to import, you may want to just actually clone an entire book. And so, for example, let's go to the Open Textbook Library. The University of Minnesota maintains this one. And let's look at under this heading of student success. So there's a whole bunch of student success textbooks. I happen to know that this one, 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 and that one are published with Pressbooks. So like, I think probably 14 of the 16 on this page are published with Pressbooks. So because they're all published with Pressbooks, let's pick the Blueprint for Success in College and Career. I think that won a big textbook award last year. So it's a nice book. This was itself a remix of an earlier open textbook. So it's a cool story of open revision. And I say, I really like this book and I'd like to just clone the entire book to my network instead of importing piece by piece. In this case, I'd come back to my menu here, and rather than clicking create a new book, I'm going to click clone a book. So anyone who has a Pressbooks account on your network can do this. You'll enter the source URL, and then you'll say, I want it to be called Blueprint for Success, and I'm going to click clone it. And again, what's happening here is our network at QUT is going to talk to the host network and say, is there a book at the URL you gave me? And the network will say yes. It will say, is this a public book? And it will say yes. And it will say, does it have a Creative Commons license that gives me the permission to clone this? And it says yes. And it says, okay, give me the book. And it's giving it the book chapter by chapter, piece by piece. What's really nice about the cloning process is when we clone a book, we'll get all of the content of the book. We'll get all of the media and the attributions, and we'll also get all of this actual interactive content, the H5P activities. All of that material will be cloned over with the book. So you can see cloning succeeded. It cloned a bunch of stuff. It took me about a minute or so. And I now have an identical copy of that Blueprint for Success in College and Career on my QUT network. And now I can localize it. You know, I can correct those very poor spelling that the Americans use, where they leave the U's out of color and things like that. You know, all the things that you have to correct for when you're working with Americans, right? So there's a number of things that you can now do in this book, and you can see here's my local copy. And you'll notice that if I were to visit this book, you'll see all the attribution information was preserved. It still has the Creative Commons license that the original had. And there will be a book source information that will say, this book is a cloned version of link to the original. So we'll make sure that we're providing proper attribution and linking back to the source so that you can fulfill your obligations under the Creative Commons license there. You can also display a comparison tool on the chapter level. If you'd like me to show you that later, I can, or you can just read about it in the guide. I'll pause there and say that's another way to get content in. That's importing, and that's cloning. Anyone have questions or want me to pause and go deeper into anything you've seen so far? Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll show you how do you take, I was showing you a couple home pages for books earlier. And if you go to my training demo book that I've created, you'll notice this is at the beginning a very sad homepage, right? You'll notice it's so sparse and it says all rights reserved, which makes it sad in a certain way. And there's just a, demo cover, and there's no, there is some contents, but the metadata is quite sparse. So all of the information that appears here is entered from a book info page. So what I'll show you next is how you can enter and edit the metadata for a book. So editing the book's homepage. In your dashboard menu, there is a link called Book Info. And this is where you'd enter information that you want to appear on the book's homepage. So for example, the title of the book. I might give this a subtitle, A Fake Book for Testing. I already used that once, so I like it. And then I could list a number of contributors. So an author, an editor, a translator, a reviewer, an illustrator, etc. Let me save this book info and show you how I can make new contributors. So if I wanted to create a new contributor, I'd click this link and I'd say, I'm going to give Kate Nixon some credit here. And I'm going to give Katya some credit here. So I've created 2 new contributors in this book. And Sarah, you were the first person to talk to me on this call, so I'll have to give you some credit.
Thanks, Theo.
Okay, so now I come back in and I've created some contributors. And I'm going to start assigning roles to people. So Kate, thank you for your hard work as an editor. And Sarah, thank you for being a reviewer. And Katya, and who else did I have? And Sarah, we'll say you're both contributors. Now we'll say the publisher is Steel, oh yeah, Steel Press, I like that. Publisher city, we'll say Madison, Wisconsin. And the publication date, I'll set it in the future, 31st of May. Actually, let's make it April Fool's Day. That's fitting, right? There we go. And then here's where you'd enter the ISBN if you have one for the ebook, an ISBN if you have one for the print book, and the DOI for the book if you've issued one or you have one. And then you can also set the language. The language will help control the metadata in the book. Many times, authors are writing books in languages other than English, and so you can change the language to whatever the language is. You'll notice that there are many variants of English, and you may be quite proud of Australian English, and you may choose to make sure everybody knows in your metadata this is Australian English rather than the Queen's English or whatever else you might call it. Okay, you can add a cover image here. You can indicate what the subject of the book is or the additional subject. These will be terms taken from a taxonomy provided by a group called thema.org. And so you start to type, and let's say we say this book is about training. I wonder what's available. Oh, teacher training, perfect. There's a good subject for this book. The copyright holder here, it's me. And I really like the CC BY license personally. I could add an additional copyright notice if I wanted to. And then I could say a tagline for my book, a short description, and a slightly longer description. This is a book I'm making for a demo training. And I'm going to save all this information here. Now, although my homepage is still somewhat sad, it's less sad. And I'll say visit the site. And you'll see, okay, the information that I've just displayed is starting to be displayed here on this homepage. The subtitle, the description, or my name, a short description, the Creative Commons license. And now down in the metadata, you're seeing the teacher training, and we're seeing credit being given to Kate and Sarah and Katya and Sarah, and some extra of the metadata I entered. So that's how you enter metadata and how you kind of make sure that your book's information is up to date. That's all through that book info tool. And there's quite a lot of information that is possible and can be entered for whatever you publish. It can be revised and edited at any time, and when it's saved, the homepage is immediately updated, and that information gets updated with that. Any questions about book info or metadata generally?
Hi, Stu, it's Katya again. There was an older question up above from Matthew Fletcher, wondering if Pressbooks offers view and interact analytics.
Great question. I didn't see the question, so I'm sorry I missed it. But so yes, you can connect your Pressbooks network with a Google Analytics dashboard. A network manager would need to do that. So your whole network could be connected with Google Analytics dashboard, and then your network manager, so that'd probably be Kate or Katya or Sarah, I believe, could then provide information about page views or number of downloads or other kinds of information that Google Analytics tracks.
Yeah. Kate, I think we've set that up. Is that right? Or we talked about doing that?
We talked about it, but we haven't quite done that yet.
Okay, well, we don't have any books yet, so that's okay.
We haven't, I was going to say, we don't have any published books yet, so it's all right.
Yeah, yeah, but we will be doing that, Matthew. Yeah, cool.
Are there any other questions that I missed? Okay. So the next thing I want to show you then is after you've entered book info or you've brought some content in, you may want to create new content, or you may want to use the Pressbooks visual editor, or you may just want to rearrange your book. So the place that most authors spend most of their time is actually in this organize section right here. So every book will have an organize block. And in the organize block, you'll see at the top a global privacy setting. And if the book is set to public, that means anyone in the world can visit the public URL of this book as a signed out user and see your book. So it's public to the web. If I were to sign back in and make this book private, then only people who are authorized users would be able to see it. So I've just made this book private, and I'll show you now. If I visit this book and I log out, I'll now see a message. I didn't do it properly because I didn't see the right message. Let me go ahead and okay, my book setting is set to private. I've done something wrong because I shouldn't be able to see this private book. So I've done something wrong, but trust me that it normally works. A live demo, something always goes a bit strange. It didn't properly process my logging out because I'm still logged in. Dear. In any case, if you make a book private, it's not visible on the public web. I'm confident that that is the case, even if my demo doesn't reflect that confidence. Okay, the other thing that you can then do is you can add new front matter. You can add what we call parts, and we can add what we call chapters or back matter. So to show you that, we might say, let's add a dedication to this book. So I'd click the add front matter button. Now I'm logged out for some reason. Okay, and then I would say, let's add a dedication. So I'm going to select dedication type, and I say this is a dedication. I say dedicate this book to my maternal grandmother, Sarah. Okay, so I've created a dedication here. And here, this dedication now is new front matter in my book. You can see that the editor here is a pretty basic WYSIWYG or visual editor. It looks very familiar if you've worked with WordPress before. And it also would look familiar if you've used something like Microsoft Word. A lot of these tools will be familiar. I'll give you a bit of a deeper dive into them in just a moment. If I wanted to view the front matter, you could say, okay, here's my dedication. It's dedicated to Sarah Owens. That looks nice. All right. Come back to the edit the book, and I go back to organize, and I could say, oh, I actually want the dedication to come before the introduction. So I could either drag and drop it, or I could move it up. You'll also see in these columns that every piece of content can either be shown or hidden from the web version, which means to make it private. It can also be included or excluded from any export files I make. And that's true of every piece of granular content in the book. The next thing I'm going to do is add a new part, and I'll call this Unit 2. So I've created a new part in the book. And once I have parts, I can move content between them. So for example, I want all of this content to come down and be in the second part of the book. And I want it to appear in this order. And there we go. So I've just reordered my book and moved some things around. and I have a private book here. So let me actually go back to this demo to instill my and your confidence in. I'm now logged out. Okay. If I visit training, I'm still logged in. What in the world is happening? All right. Maybe I can.
I had a look at our QUT ebooks page, and it's definitely not visible there.
Okay.
Yeah, it may be your caching or something, but we believe you. We believe you.
All right. There's always something in a demo like this, right? Okay. So you can see what I've started to do is create different organizational units for my book, and inside each organizational unit, I can have as many or as few chapters as I would like. And so let's say I want to create a new chapter. And this chapter is going to be about a great feature of Queensland marine life. It'll be about the Great Barrier Reef, yeah? So let's say I come into the content, and the first thing I'd like to do is add what we would call a text box, and I want to add some learning objectives. So I click this button, and what it's just done is it's already built a pre-made text box built for learning objectives. So I could say learning objectives for this chapter if I wanted to customize it. And then I could say first, you will learn more about conservation of the reef. Second, you will be able to identify the primary threats to the reef and actions we can take to preserve its health. Long-term health. Okay, so I've created a little text box here, and then I might say, I'd now like to make a little heading, and I'll say, about the reef. The Great Barrier Reef. Blah, blah, blah. You can see that I can do bold text, I can make italics, I can choose from any number of different heading set like sequential headings. We'll want to use them generally in order, but this was created as an H1. I might come down a bit further and I'll say photos of the reef. And that might be a new section of the book, so I turn that into another heading. Photos here. And then I might say videos about the reef. This is not the best book I've ever written, but it's serving demo purposes here. And then I'd say, okay, I can make a block quote. I can create a link. So maybe I want to make a link to whatever website I want to make a link to. Let's say pressbooks.org. And I've just created a link here. And I can edit that link. And I can cause it to open a new tab. Any of the kinds of things you'd want to do with the link. Let's make that HTTPS. Sorry about that. And I can also set a bunch of style formats. So the one that I wanted to show is if you are working in a language that the alphabet runs right to left, you might want to select right to left, and it's going to make it easier to display a right to left display language. You can also do common kind of book formatting things like pull quotes or hanging indents for a works cited page or what have you. So you just select the text you want to apply it to and then apply the format. The end of this chapter, I'm going to add another text box, which would be key takeaways. And here in the About the Reef, I'm going to add an exercises. And in the photos section, I want to add an examples text box. So I've just put a bunch of text boxes in. In the textual editor, I may also want to do things like add a table. So I can create a table and insert it. And there's a bunch of other properties and tools that I can use to make this table more accessible or to change its appearance or control it visually. I might also want to apply a class if I wanted to style something later with CSS. That's a little bit in the weeds, so I'll only go into it if people have questions. I could apply an anchor, which lets me put an internal link somewhere. I could also apply an example of code. This isn't a book about coding, but let's say I wanted to put an example of I'm a heading. And I don't want this to be rendered as a heading, I just want it to display as code. So I clicked that code button and it meant that anything inside of it will be wrapped as a code. The next thing I may want to do is make a footnote. So to make a footnote, I just press the button, it asks for my content, I'm a footnote. And what Pressbooks will do is it will make something called a short code. So this content will be the footnote. Oops. This content in here is the substance of the footnote. And this is the delimiter saying whatever comes in between will be a footnote. I could then take that footnote and I could add a link to that footnote too if I wanted to. And voila, I made a footnote. The next thing I'm going to do is to say, well, this is nice. I've got some text. Let's go ahead and preview it, see how it looks so far. My web book, I've got my title, I've got my learning objectives, I've got my link, I've got my footnote. That's looking fine. I've got my code example, my exercises. But the page is a bit visually drab. And if I want to actually help people understand the Great Barrier Reef, maybe I want to add some media or an image. So I've gone to the Creative Commons search and I've searched for Great Barrier Reef. And I found a quite interesting photo taken by someone on Flickr that has a permissive Creative Commons license. So let me go and find this image actually on Flickr, which I've done. And I'm going to download the medium size of this image. And this was taken by James W. Thompson. So I'll come into this book and I'll say in my section that says photos of the reef, we'll click add media. I'm going to upload the photo I've just downloaded. I'm going to give it an alt text. And I think he called this the Agincourt Ribbon Reef. And the title we'll say is also that. The description we'll leave blank. And then there's a place for me to give attributions for media files that I've used from somewhere else. So the source URL I take from Flickr. I drop it in here. The author was, I suspect that he actually writes his name without underscores. And then I could enter the URL for James here from this website if I wanted to. I could copy this link and come back to the author URL. And then in this particular case, this image was published under a CC BY NC SA license. So I'd say CC BY NC SA, non-commercial share alike. I didn't make any adaptations, so I'm just going to insert this image into the chapter and voila, the image is there. The next thing I'm going to do is say I'd also like a video. So I went to YouTube and I found a National Geographic documentary about the Great Barrier Reef. I like this, I want to use it. I'm going to copy that URL. I'm going to come back to Pressbooks, make a new line and paste the video, and it will automatically turn it into an embedded video. We'll do this for YouTube or Vimeo and other tools that support the OEmbed standard. So there's a handful of common tools that will just automatically become embeds. So I've made some media, I've made some other kinds of things. I'm ready to create that. You know what I didn't do? I didn't do a glossary item, so let's do that as well. So conservation. I'll define that word for my students. And I'm going to click insert glossary term. And it says we didn't find a glossary term for conservation yet, so you're going to have to make one. Okay, so I'll say conservation refers to the preservation of a limited, let's say preservation and care for a limited resource. That's not the, anyway, it's a definition. So I've created a glossary term. And just like with the footnote, it's created a little shortcode here. I'm going to create and view my chapter now. So I've made the chapter. I'll view it here in Pressbooks and you say, okay, here's my glossary term. There's my definition. You saw the other pieces earlier. Here's my image. And then at the bottom, here's my embedded video. There are a couple of things that we can do to change the appearance of this page or some of the display settings, but I want to pause there and ask for any questions about the visual editor and about how you could use Pressbooks to start making content or editing or improving content. Okay, two great questions in the chat. I'll take them in turn. So Peter's question is, can screen readers read the content? And the answer to that is yes. So what's happening here is when we're viewing this chapter, what we're seeing here, this is just HTML. And so we build it with accessible output, but if you were to inspect this source, you'll see here is an H1 with entry title, here is a div, and inside this div there is a text box. So all of this stuff we try to use accessible markup and we try to use ARIA elements where necessary. And so users of assistive technology, provided that you've made the right, if you've used, for example, if you didn't add an alt text to this image, it wouldn't be accessible, but if you do follow general good accessibility guidelines, Pressbooks generally takes care of the rest and makes accessible output for users of assistive technology, including screen readers. If you want to read a little bit more about our accessibility practices, we have both, we have an accessibility statement on our website that's kind of a high-level overview, and then linked from that statement, we also have a VPAT, which is an industry standard, like it attests to how well we complied with the WCAG guidelines for accessibility for the 2.0A and AA guidelines. And this is for the authoring platform itself. So we worked hard and we are committed to making sure that the authoring platform is as accessible as possible, and that generally people are able to create accessible content by default by following some basic best practices. The second question is, are glossary terms added at each point where the word occurs in the text? And the answer to that is no. So the glossary term is created, but it will only appear where it's associated. So let's say I wrote a bit more about conservation here. The reef is in danger at places and widespread conservation efforts are underway. Okay, so here the word conservation appears a second time. And if you preview this, you'll notice this one has a glossary term and this one doesn't, because I haven't associated the glossary with this occurrence of the word. I can, however, do that, and I can do that anywhere in the book. So if I were to select conservation, the second occurrence, and click glossary, this time it will say, oh, we see that there already is a glossary term for this word. Do you want to just use that glossary term? And I'll say, oh yeah, I do actually. And so what it will do is it will associate that word with the existing glossary term. So now both instances of conservation are associated with the same existing definition. So that's sort of how glossary works. It's really up to the author to decide which occurrence of the word they want to be glossaryified and which ones they don't, because we can't assume that we know. Most of the time authors will want either the first occurrence in the book or maybe the first occurrence in a chapter, and they'll decide for themselves their practice and then apply it throughout the book. That was another great question. Anybody else have questions about creating content or things you may want to see here in Pressbooks? Okay, so let's presume or assume that I've created some content here, and now I'd like to change its appearance. So you'll notice that I've got a certain typeface selected and I've got some colors here, and I might not like those. I might want it to be different. So in the admin menu, just under Organize and Book Info, there's a tool called Appearance. And the first thing that you'll see when you click Appearance are themes. So a book theme is basically like a skin or a flavor for the book. And you can see on your network, we have 21 different themes that are available for your book. Selecting a new theme will change the overall look and feel of the book. And you can see kind of a preview of what the theme may look like here. So I'm going to pick Malala, which is quite a popular theme for textbooks. I'll say Activate. And so now I just clicked Activate, and when I load my chapter, you'll notice, if I go into the book, where was the chapter I was just at? You can see the colors have changed, the typefaces have changed. A number of elements in this book look visually different now. I might say I like Malala, but there's a few things I want to change, but I'd like Malala generally better. So once I've selected a theme that I'm mostly happy with, there's a number of theme options that will be available. And here I can decide, do I want part and chapter numbers? Actually, I don't like the numbering, so let's get rid of that. Or maybe I do want the part and chapter numbers, but instead of calling them part, I want to call them section, and I want to call the chapter a unit. That's how I'm referring to it in my book. And then I'll also say, in this book, I want a second level table of contents, which means every time I use a heading 1 in my book, I want it to display in the table of contents and be visible from my TOC. So that's a nice feature, and if I want that, I can turn that on. And I also definitely want to display my media attributions, since I took the time to enter James's attribution, and he deserves to have credit for his photographs, so let's turn that on. You may want to declare support for an alphabet or a script that uses a different alphabet or different language set of characters than the standard Latin alphabet that we use. So for example, if I'm working in Chinese, or if I'm working Gujarati or Japanese, you can declare support for any number of other languages or scripts in your book. And that will just make sure that we install the fonts that you need to display all the characters in that language set in the book and the exports. You can also choose to display the copyright license at the individual chapter level in cases where it differs from the book level. And you can customize the color of those text boxes. Earl just asked a question about whether the TOC can include lower levels. Right now, it only includes one level below the chapter, which is the H1 level. So what we would recommend is if you want your table of contents to be more granular, probably break the books up so that the chapter itself is close to an atomic level, and you can have one level of granularity below the chapter. And if chapter is not the right name for it at that point, then you may want to say something like subsection or section, subsection. You can change the label that applies to it if chapter isn't the right name for your unit of content. And then you could customize the colors. So in this case, I don't like the green for learning objectives, but I do like a very calm blue here. And I'd like the background to be a very light, kind of periwinkle. Is that the right word for that? I like descriptive names for colors, but I don't always know. Okay. So I've just changed globally in the book. All my learning objectives boxes should now be blue. I can then look at the web options and say, okay, actually in this book, I want the typeface to be different. I prefer crimson text for my header text. And for the body, I like a nice sans serif. I want it to be open sans. And I want the book to be a little bit wider. And I like to skip lines between paragraphs. And I'm going to show the images in a light box. So I've made a couple of choices here for this book. Let's go back and look and see how it looks. Let me refresh this so you'll notice some changes. The typeface changed, the book got a little wider, and my learning objectives colors have changed. And you'll also notice here, in this particular chapter, all those H1s I put in earlier are now appearing in the table of contents, and I could jump to them. I spelled videos wrong, I just noticed, but at least it's an anchor in the text. And those are some of the changes that I just made visible through my theme options. If you want to go even deeper in the weeds, you may not, but you can customize your theme even further with custom CSS. And CSS is the style language which controls the appearance of web pages. You'll notice that each book has 3 style sheets, one for the web, one for the ebook export, and one for the PDF export. And you could customize those in turn. At the top, you'll see here are all the existing CSS rules that control the appearance of your book. And here are your individual customizations. So you can overwrite various parts of the book's rules to make it appear different if you want to further customize the appearance of your book. There are chapters about all of this in our guide, so I won't go into it in exhaustive detail here. I'm trying to be more high level and brief, but there's some pretty powerful tools to make sure your book looks and appears the way you want it to. Thanks, Kate. Appreciate you being here. It sounds like you're heading out. I'm going to then pause for a second and ask for any questions about appearance or theming or theme options in case I didn't get to them earlier. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is then once I have a finished book. So let's not use my training demo book anymore. Well, that's fine, we do, I guess. We're going to then say, I'd like to make this book available in offline formats. So I want to export the book. Again, we can see from this menu, here are all the parts of the book that will be included when I make my export. I actually don't want to include any of this main body section. I want to just leave it out. So I'm going to select the heading and say, okay, this export's only going to have dedication introduction, and it's going to have this unit 2. That's all I want to include in my exports. So then I'm going to come to the export menu and say, well, what formats do I want to make this book available in? I'd like to make a print PDF, an EPUB, and an XML file, sure. And I'll say, click export your book. So what Pressbooks is doing now is with one click, it's saying, okay, we're going to make these quick exports for you. And hopefully you'll see that in 30 seconds or so, we'll have made export files that are available to download and share and use how I want. Okay, so I have an EPUB available, I have a print PDF, and I have an XML file. Let's download the print PDF and just look at it. So it's a 31-page book. Here's a PDF that's already formatted to look like a book. That looks pretty nice as a title page. Here's my copyright page. Here's my dedication. Here's my table of contents. Okay, that's pretty attractive. And then here's the actual content in my book. So this looks ready to print. That was fairly nice. I didn't have to do any editing. If I come back down to the very bottom, you'll see here's my chapter about the Great Barrier Reef. And you can notice my photos included. When it came to my video, it says, oh, we can't put a video in a print PDF, but there was a video here. If you want to see it, here's where you could find it on the web. And so we'll do that with interactive elements. And then you'll see here's my attribution for the image by James Thompson. And there's my print PDF. I might decide though that I didn't like the look of the print PDF and I want to customize that. If I go back into Appearance Theme Options, there's a number of PDF options here where you can customize the PDF appearance. So for example, I might decide, I didn't like the A4 size. I want this book to actually be a full 8.5 by 11 inches, or whatever dimensions you want the PDF to be. You can change them. You can change the margin sizes and a bunch of other print PDF settings. But without having to know code or without having to learn InDesign, you can really customize the look and feel of your PDFs here with a number of these settings. So those are things that are available to you in preparing and producing exports. I've made 3 exports, but if you notice at the book homepage, these exports aren't yet available to download. They're available to me, who made them. I can download them from here and then I could share them in the LMS or email them to someone. But I might also say this is an open book. I really do want it to be available to anyone who visits it. So to change that, I would come into Settings, Sharing and Privacy, and I would say, yes, I want the latest export files to be available on the homepage for free to everyone. So once I change that setting, now when I refresh this page, you'll see those 3 export files can now be downloaded by any visitor to this book's homepage. So that's a quick overview of how to do exports and how to share them and make them available. I'll pause for a second here and ask if there's any questions about producing exports and the different kinds of exports you might want to make. I know this can be a little bit complicated, and there probably are some questions about various exports and what they're good for.
Hi everybody, Katja here. Just want to confirm that we do have all the detailed guides up on our QT ebooks page that you can refer to. Yep. So you don't have to remember everything right now.
Yeah, it's impossible, I think, to remember it all for one training, but hopefully this is helping you see how you can use many of the kind of basic features. Another thing that you may want to do at some point, would it only appear in QUT Pressbooks if it is public, asks Laura. Yes. So in order for people to be able to visit the homepage of your book, it needs to be listed globally as public. You can keep the book private and you can add individuals and give them read-only access if you'd like. But it's most common that books are made public and put on the open web. Even if they're all rights reserved, they can still be made public. But most of the time, I think most of our users are interested in open education in some form or another. So again, that's totally up to the author. We're getting a little tight on time, but I want to show 2 final things, and it is there are a number of other plugins that you can use to do interesting things. So on your network, H5P is one of the interesting plugins that lets you create interactive content. To turn that on, you would come to this menu and click Activate. Hypothesis is already active by default, but it's not turned on for your book, so I'll show you that in a second. There's a plugin that lets you write in Markdown, which is a form of kind of a simplified HTML markup language. If you'd like to use Markdown editing, you can turn that on with this plugin called Parsedown Party. And then there's a plugin that lets you do interactive tables called Table Press. And we support LaTeX rendering and math rendering with a tool called MathJax natively, but there is an additional plugin, an optional replacement called WP Quick LaTeX that adds a couple of other math-specific features, but with the downside that instead of rendering it with MathJax, it renders them as images in the webbook. So there's a bit of an accessibility trade-off. They all have alt text, but it's a bit nicer in the browser if you use MathJax. I can show you any of these plugins. The first thing I will show you very quickly is if you want to use the annotation tool Hypothesis, it's as simple as coming to settings, hypothesis, and then choosing where on the book you want to allow it. So we'll say, let's allow it on parts and chapters, front matter and back matter. I'll click Save Changes. I'll visit my book. And now when I visit this new chapter on the Great Barrier Reef, I haven't installed any tools in my browser, but you'll notice this annotation tool lives in the pane there. And if I were to select some text, I'd see this little annotation frame pop up. If I were logged in to Hypothesis, I could make annotations freely and turn them on or off, make them visible, invisible. And that was all I needed to do to make the annotation layer work on my book. Earl asked, is it possible to import and use any LaTeX or LaTeX packages? How are these enabled? Generally, yes. So by default, you'll notice, this is a math specific question, so some of you may enjoy it, some of you may not. By default, you'll notice in settings, we have a MathJax tool natively built in, and we support 3 different types of input syntax, one for LaTeX or LaTeX, one for ASCII and one for MathML, and it kind of gives you the supported syntaxes for now. Where we'd like to expand the syntax and include other types of expected LaTeX or LaTeX syntax, but right now these are the expected ones. And you can configure the text color and what type or fonts are used when we render SVGs and PNGs here. If you'd like to use the plugin gives you the ability to declare and add support for other packages that may not be included natively. So this might be a case where you want to use that MathJax plugin. To do that, you'd come into plugins and you'd say activate. And then you'll notice that the settings tool has been replaced with Quick LaTeX. And here you'll see a bunch of description for how this particular tool works. You'll see some of the basic settings. And then here in advanced, you'll see the ability to set up your LaTeX preamble and define new commands and additional packages. So that's, if there is a package that isn't included natively that you wanted to add support for, sometimes people want to do things like, I think they show it here. This is like the TXZ picture package. It's pretty fun. And that's how you do that. I hope that answered your question, Earl. I think we've probably corresponded a little bit about very complicated math things that were a bit over my head, so thanks for your patience. And if it's Earl Duncan, that is. And then the last thing I'll show you is once you've activated H5P, here to use H5P or to create new H5P, you'd come through this menu and click through a few things. And then you'll see I'm creating H5P activities directly in the Pressbooks book. These activities will be saved and stored on the same server as your book, and you can use any of the available H5P activity types. If you haven't seen or used H5P before, it's really worth taking some time to look at it and think about it. These are really superlative, interactive activities of all different kinds. Generally, if I want to use an activity and I haven't built one before, they'll often provide, let's say I want to build a find the hotspot activity. I'll need to install the library the first time I use it. It'll take a few seconds, and then it says I'm ready to use. When I come into the ready to use, it's usually going to provide an example and often a tutorial, which will help me learn how to build this activity type. And it's generally a matter of filling in the form builder. I can also, though, find an example of an H5P activity that already exists. Usually H5Ps are openly licensed, so I would click reuse. I could download this source file. I could come back to Pressbooks, and rather than creating a new activity, I could say upload. I could upload the file I had just downloaded. I can then take this file in, and now I don't have to build the activity. The activity is already built, and I could then just edit or modify it. So here, which of these berries is named after a town in Turkey? Is it the cherry? Oh, nice job, Steele. Okay. So there I've made this activity. It's ready to use. And I can use it in the book in 2 ways. I can either copy and paste the short code or anywhere in the book that I have an editor. So I come to Great Barrier Reef and I want to teach people about fruit. Sure. I'm going to click Add H5P, find the activity I want to insert, click Insert, and that's how I would add interactive activities into my book. They'll just display and appear with the book there. So I know I've gone just a little bit over time if you were expecting this to last an hour. That concludes the kind of demo portion. And I know that it did move quickly, so I'll pause here and say, what last questions or things would you like to ask or know about Pressbooks that I haven't already addressed? Okay, so Matthew Fletcher asked, is it possible to embed code notebooks such as Jupyter notebooks? I would say that the answer to that is yes and no. So the Jupyter notebooks are a bit of a unique case. So you can embed content from lots of externally hosted and created sites. If it's a site that requires you to run additional code, then that's a little bit more difficult. So Jupyter notebooks, for example, if you're expecting them to run commands or to run things within the notebook, I don't think that that's possible right now in Pressbooks, though it's on our feature roadmap. I don't understand Jupyter notebooks as well as I would like to. So Matthew, please help me maybe, and then maybe it would happen faster. I don't think there's a real technical reason why we can't. We just haven't built the integration for it yet. And the more users that tell us they want it, the faster we'll likely do that. So I think the answer is no, not right now, but we'd love to do it in the future, I hope. Thanks, Catherine. I'm glad you like Larry Niedecker. I do too. And Gabrielle, okay, thank you. You're welcome. So the last thing that I do want to mention is all of you may be new Pressbooks users. You might decide this is a tool that's useful to you in your library work or your teaching and instruction work. We hope that you do learn more about the tool through the guide and through self-paced training. If you do have support questions, you have network managers there at your campus that are meant to be the first line of support. I believe that you know how to contact them since they invited you to this. If they get stumped or if there's a question that they can't answer, they do have access to us as Pressbook staff to provide premium support. So the place to go would be your local friendly librarians generally, and then they have a premium support access, and we try to answer questions as quickly as we can for them and get people unstuck.
Steele, I've just put our email address there, opentextbooks@qut.edu.au, and Sarah, Kate, and I have access to that, or you can just contact us individually. But that's the contact email we've got on the QUT Pressbooks site. And I've also just put a link to the Pressbooks help page, which has all the fabulous guides that Pressbooks have put together. But while I'm on, I just want to take the opportunity to thank Steele so much for that. That was really fabulous overview. Every time we speak with you, I'm more and more impressed with Pressbooks. So thanks again for spending some time in your evening to show us all about Pressbooks. I think there's one more question about from Jacinta as well.
Okay, Jacinta, this is a really interesting question and it's a little bit complicated. I'll read it out in case people can't see the chat. Is there information about how to easily import R Markdown documents? So R Markdown are really interesting in a kind of unique case because it's a hybrid of both R, the statistical processing language, and Markdown. So R Markdown, it depends. So if you turn it into Markdown that doesn't require you to process R, then sure, that's great. But if it still requires you to run and process R, then it's not going to function inside of Pressbooks. It's going to need the R processing engine still, and that there's not an easy or a good way to do that. I was working with Danielle Navarro, or with a book that Danielle produced, an openly licensed book that was largely built in R Markdown. And as long as you had a tool, I'm getting a little bit in the weeds, but I think there's a tool called Knitter, which is the most popular one. They use Knitter to process and produce kind of flat Markdown afterwards. That content was a lot easier to bring into Pressbooks, but if it still requires computation or processing, it just won't work. It needs something that can run R, and that's it's not Pressbooks that can do that. And then Earl asked, is cross-referencing supported? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Jacinta, and that might be a great question to bring to your librarians, and they might bring it to our support desk, and it would be an opportunity for us to learn a bit more about it. I would need to do some more research to really understand it in depth, but we would try to do that and get a good answer to you soon. It sounds like you're probably a pretty advanced power user of whatever software tool you're writing with already, if you're doing it in R Markdown. Earl, your question about cross-referencing, yes, if you'd like, I can quickly show you that. I understand if people would like to leave the call, but so for example, in this chapter here, in Great Barrier Reef, I'm going to produce an anchor link. Right here, I'll put a link that's called photos. Okay. So I've just made an anchor that should point to this text that says photos of the reef, right? So So what I need to know now is what's the URL of this chapter. So I know that it's, sorry, I know that it's this. And I happen to know that the anchor that I created was called photos. So I come somewhere else in the book, let's say chapter 2 columns, and I say, see photos of Great Barrier Reef. I can't type barrier. Okay. So what I would do here is then I would say, let's make a link. And so in this particular link, I'm going to create a link, and I'll make the URL that I copied, and then I'll add a little hash photos. Except I don't want it after that. I think I want it just like this. Okay, so what I've created now is a link not only to the internal chapter, but to an anchor within that chapter. So I would say save, and then here when I view this chapter, photos of the Great Barrier Reef should take me to that chapter and to the particular anchor I just created. There it goes, it took me to the anchor. It's a lot simpler to create links to just a chapter itself rather than to a point inside the chapter. So I could do that, for example, I'm going to create a link to the bug here. So I will say link, and then when I start typing the bug, you can see, oh, okay, well, here are a list of my chapters here. Let's say I want to make a link to editing summary. And so I've just created an internal link to another chapter. I could pull it from a drop-down list as I started typing, and that's another way to make internal links. A third way to do it, if we really want to get technical and interesting, is you can create any number of anchor links actually with the annotation tool. So when I do this and I create an annotation, I say I'm a comment. What I really love about Hypothesis is that every one of these links is addressable as a unique URL. So when I click share and copy this URL, let's say I send it to a student who had a question about my text. I just send them this URL, and what it will do is it will take them to the comment that I made and open up the annotated text in the pane for them. So I thought about this a lot when I was trying to answer student questions about something they read. In the olden days, I'd be like, well, if you looked on page 74, third paragraph, here's your answer. And now what I would do is just write my thoughts as an annotation and send them a link to the annotation. And then everyone in the class could turn exactly to where I wanted them to turn to. And not only would they turn there, they would also see my remarks or my link or my image or whatever it was that I added to help explain the muddy passage. So hopefully that's the answer that you were looking for, Earl. Okay, thanks. What about references? Can those be imported from a BibTeX file? No, not currently. What I'd really like us to do in the near future is to add support for Zotero, which is a kind of popular reference manager tool. It's open source. The big block that we need to get to is that in many cases, the Zotero integration that we have in mind uses shortcodes, and those shortcodes will often need to live inside of footnotes, which are also shortcodes. And so we have to run a process of rendering a shortcode inside of a shortcode, which is a little bit complicated, but we are a large part of the way towards figuring that out. Once we do that, we'd like to have a working integration with Zotero, which would let you bring references in and display them pretty quickly and natively in Pressbooks. I don't know when we'll do that, but hopefully in 2020 and hopefully not too much longer. But right now, no, you can't import from BibTeX, unfortunately. If they were exported XML, yes, it's possible they could be imported. You'd need to look at, if you have the capability to do that, then you have the capability to do a lot of dangerous things. So please feel free to experiment and play around. If you get stuck, send us a support email and we can dig into it too. Yeah. If you're capable of working with XML, a lot of stuff is possible there. Yeah, the import is pretty capacious. I'm going to say let's probably wrap up. If you want to stay a bit longer and ask other questions, I have a bit more time. Everybody else in my house is asleep, so.
Thanks, Dill. I think we'll let you go to sleep as well.
Yeah.
But if anybody has any questions, just either contact myself, Sarah, or Kate, or just drop us a line at opentextbooks@qut.edu.au. Hi, Sarah.
Hello. Thank you so much, Steele. That was awesome.
My pleasure. I'll try to process the recording and I'll share it with you as soon as it's done. Zoom has been had a bit of a delay with recording processing because of global surge in use, I think, but
Yeah.
hopefully it'll be within the next day or two.
Great. Thank
That's
you.
fabulous. Thanks so
Great.
much. Have a
Thanks,
good night and have a good
Thanks,
day.
Dale.
everybody else.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.